Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's session of the 1000 Plateaus reading group. This week we'll be discussing 3 plateaus. The second plateau on one or many wolves, one or several wolves. The 8th plateau, which is the 3 novellas, or what happened, and the 11th plateau, which is of the refrain. My guess is that the third of these chapters is probably going to take up the bulk of the conversation, but I think all 3 of these plateaus are integral, really, to the book as a whole, and serve to function as each introduce really important things within the text. So we got kind of a small group today, but I'm fine doing a lot of talking. That is what is required. And last week we forgot to have somebody to ask questions, so I can be in charge of that for this week. So I think just to start off, I thought I'd go through some of the key concepts that are kind of introduced in the 3 plateaus, because I think each of them kind of introduces something that's integral to the text. So I'll start with the 3 novellas, or what happened. And this plateau really, to me, is about these 3 lines. There's the rigid lines, the supple lines, and the lines of flight, and it tries to lay out how these 3 sorts of lines interact with one another in the context of 3 novellas. And I think that these lines are really behind a lot of what's going on in this text. I think the line of flight, the 3rd line, is integral to understanding what Liz and Guattari are up to in the 1000 Plateaus, because I think that the line of flight is integral to the absolute deterritorialization that seems to be at the goal of creating change in the text. Now, the 2nd plateau, one or several wolves, is really key to understand, I think, the concept of the multiplicity, and it introduces the difference between extensive multiplicities, or arborescent multiplicities, and intensive multiplicities, which are more rhizomatic, which draws heavily upon the first plateau. And I think that it also serves as sort of this, it can help serve as a bridge from Anti-Oedipus, because it's very focused on Freudian analysis and the way that psychoanalysis puts Oedipal structures in their attempts to produce meaning in patients such as the Wolfman. And then together we kind of well, not really, but then we have the refrain. And the refrain is, I feel like it's the most technical chapter that we've dealt with so far. There are a lot of terms introduced here. We have milieu, we have rhythm, we have an understanding of how these concepts are produced out of chaos. We have the refrain, which sort of comes about in the territorialization of these concepts, and we understand how territory is sort of a decoding of milieus, and how these territorial assemblages interact with machines. And I think this plateau really has the first definition of machine that we've run across so far, and that's on, if I recall correctly, page 333, that a machine is this thing that plugs into assemblages and and opens up lines of flight in the assemblages or closes off assemblages. And so I think the machine is really an important concept that we're going to be working with going forward. And I think that we've already sort of dealt with this machine before. And in talking about the refrain, we get an understanding of art as well, and they delve heavily into classical, romantic, and modern art as an idea of how this process of territorialization, this process of the refrain takes place. So in order to start off the conversation, I was thinking that, well, I have two questions, and I guess I can state them both, see where we want to go with them. But the first one is a question of how do we take what is applied in the refrain plateau and apply it to two different, I guess both are my questions, but for the first one, how do we apply what's happening in the refrain plateau to 1,000 Plateaus as a whole? In what way do these different plateaus function almost as songs that are resonating with one another, and bringing in perhaps different verses or different rhythms which are sort of resonating and joining in with the same song, and some are being left behind and some are being added. So that's the first sort of question. And the second question is an attempt to apply this sort of to the real world. And I'm thinking specifically of like the political world. Okay, cool, Jason. So this morning, my partner was reading through the news and saw that I think it was Denmark was instituting a new procedure for immigrants, that immigrants would have to go through a sort of class to learn about Danish culture and in order to become integrated into Denmark. And so they'd have to learn about Christmas and Easter. It was really interesting for, like prominently Muslim refugees to be learning about, or something like that. And this example, this thing really strikes me as sort of this act of territorializing this like large, powerful force attempting to subordinate a different force to its will, and thinking that it can change this group that's coming in without itself being changed. And I'm wondering if we can think about better ways of integrating different populations together in a way that isn't so problematic, but draws upon resonances of both those populations to change both, instead of one population attempting to impose its will upon another. So if anybody has any thoughts on that, I know I have thoughts on that, but I want to open up the floor to anybody else who has anything to say. Or, I can ask like a much more general question also, or maybe not general, but specific. I don't know, which of the three plateaus did you like the best?
I guess I'll end the silence here. Sorry, I'm still, I guess, to some capacity, gathering my thoughts. I'm going to turn this fan off, sorry. Gathering my thoughts with regards to like more so political applications. I think that that's something that it's something that I've thought a long time about, but haven't come to many concrete answers. The concept of the refrain itself, the rhythm, vibration that we get, is something that it's something that I've personally found very useful in my own work. Sorry, I was trying to gather my thoughts before I jumped in. I just wanted to end the silence, but I do think that in the realm of the political, we oftentimes are kind of defending. I wouldn't say we, but there is kind of a general defense of the territory and this constant need to, I wouldn't go so far as to say, people both, at least in America, both Democrats and Republicans want to expel anyone who they see as kind of opposing the territory. But I do think that there's this general need to always kind of convert someone. I am reminded of, I think it was yesterday or the day before, one of the seminars I was in with the New Center. The seminar leader said that all politics has become kind of sort of like a secular political theology in a way, and it does take on a lot of like inherently like religious associations for me, and I always want to make sure that within any action that I would promote or support, you don't want to enforce, you don't want to kind of impose. I think in avoiding that, we have to sort of wonder. I'm reminded of Gattari's text, everybody wants to be a fascist. He says the way that he ends the text by saying, the way that we sort of oppose fascism and this need to dominate, need to I'm going to just stick with dominate here, but the way that we oppose this is to link our own collective desires and wills with the will of I should say to link collective group with you're fine. Link the group with the desire and the revolutionary forces that are already inherent in it. Of course, that's like a very general answer, but if you read like further in the text, he talks in the discussion portion that comes after the essay or the lecture. I guess it's a transcript, but he speaks in the discussion portion about the material changes that must take place, and he reminds us that we can't only think of taking control of the means of production in the sense of a very the production of commodities or the production of things that we need, but also the production of subjectivity, and the ways by which subjectivation has become this sort of dominating force, especially with regards to like our contemporary condition. I think that when we think about opposing this domination, we also must think about ways in which we can allow for a group to exist in a space that allows for multiple subjectivities to be produced at once. That allows for if we can imagine a factory that produces more than one thing. Sorry, I still have really scattered thoughts, but
yeah, I just thought your idea, like talking about how it goes beyond like just material production, that they like explicitly suggest that life is a form of surplus value here, that like any consistency is going through a similar process in terms of surplus.
Yeah, I don't want to. Or I guess I should say I'm weary of any call. I've seen a few that say that we must kind of always evade identity, always evade any sort of identification with any group or any structure whatsoever. And you know, I am weary of that. I do think that it is to some capacity necessary to have that identification, but I'm a big fan of, I guess, metastability, right? Or sort of metastable modes of identifying. I think being in this sort of I think that we can sort of I'll say something just without even thinking, I guess. We can always sort of be in flight, but there's nothing saying that we cannot, for at least a moment, return, right? And I think that that's kind of sort of a vital concept here of the refrain, that we always have some relationship to the homeland, whether or not we are evading the, or I guess whether or not we're constantly in motion. And so I think with regards to kind of political implications of this, I had a thought and I lost it, and I had it again and I lost it. It keeps it keeps happening. I'm trying my best not to talk about Sun Ra, but it's so hard. But I am at least reminded of a few passages in Chaosmosis where Guattari talks about kind of the role of art, especially in producing these universes for us to exist in. And I believe it even comes up in the passage in portion of the refrain. I know it comes up many times in A Thousand Plateaus, but you know, in the works of Debussy, he says that, you know, he a single note and already enter this universe and already start to enter the universe of Debussy. I wish I had the passage actually open. That would be great. But I'll post it in.
Is it on 341? I just name search Debussy and his name comes up on 341.
Okay.
But I definitely think what you're saying is true about identity, because I don't think they just want a displacement of all identity, right? That doesn't ever seem to be what they're going for. It seems to be just that don't let identity be an absolute or be like a divine sort of rigid structure. Right? That's the danger of the rigid line. There's a danger of the rigid line just as much as there's a danger of the line of flight. That both of them can trap you in a position you don't want to be in.
Yeah, sorry. I posted a little bit. It's from Chiasmosis, page 92 and 93, where Guattari says, I'll just read a small portion here. He says, they start to exist in you, in spite of you, and not only as crude, undifferentiated affects, but as hyper-complex compositions. That's Debussy, that's jazz, that's Van Gogh. The paradox which aesthetic experience constantly returns us to is that these affects, as a mode of existential apprehension, are given all at once, regardless or besides the fact that indicative traits and descriptive refrains are necessary for catalyzing their experience in fields of representation. And then I'm just going to skip a bit of it, but in short, affect is not a question of representation and discursivity, but of existence. I find myself transported into a Debussyist universe, a blues universe, a blazing becoming of Provence. I have crossed a threshold of consistency. Before the hold of this block of sensation, this nucleus of partial subjectivation, everything was dull. Beyond it, I am no longer as I was before. I am sucked away by a becoming other, carried beyond my familiar existential territories. Yeah, I'm a huge fan, personally, at least, of the idea that not only within art or literature or within any what we would consider kind of fine art or art in general, I like the idea that Sun Ra proposes of like music being about composition itself. And I believe in what is philosophy. They also say that we could kind of define art by solely by composition, and what is composed. It would be kind of like the only way that we can think of it. I find that like relevant here because of course in like this whole chapter and the chapter after, Guattari is talking almost explicitly about art itself being a block of affects and precepts or percepts, right? And the ways in which not only the composition of like a work of art, as we're talking about here, but also of, I think even more generally, we can think about these things in regards to the realm of architecture and regards to the realm of like design, even just with regards to like products. There are ways in which they can allow for certain things to be produced within us, allow for certain modes of subjectivation to take primacy and to allow for us to leave our familial existential territories, our homelands. But we can start to propose at least this question with regards to how can we start to produce that sort of, I guess, transportation in a way, or I guess how, yeah, I'll say that. I think that has a lot of political implications of allowing things to be always in connection to this question of sort of transportation, or always in connection to this question of subjectivation, and the ways in which our experiences are both aided or negatively affected by these things. I'm reminded, very simple thing, but I'm reminded of in the ethics part 4, the definition of good and bad, that what is good is useful to us, what is bad is it stops that sort of useful thing from being actualized. And I think that we can sort of apply, at least in part, a lot of these concepts into the ways in which design functions for us, and the ways in which not just art, but all composition can be good in a way, can be useful, and can allow for more than one use, and not just impose a use or only allow for one use. Yeah.
Well, one thing I really appreciate about the refrain is the songbird example that like keeps getting used throughout. And I think what I really appreciate about the songbird example is that it shows the selective nature of the refrain. You can't just put it's just not a completely new song that is adopted by the songbird. The songbird sings a song, but it hears another song of another songbird, and parts of that song might resonate with the song that the songbird is singing. So it might select elements of that new song to put within its song. And over time, as it adopts new songs, its song becomes something completely different than the song that was before. And I think that this just shows like the selective nature of change in Deleuze and Guattari's work, is that it's not like simply this complete and radical, utter, just instantaneous shift. It's an intensive shift that's always occurring. It's always becoming. Becoming doesn't just happen. You just don't change from one state to another. Sure, you at some point you cross a threshold, but you've been working your way up to that threshold the whole time. And I think the act of resonance really makes sense politically, because if you want to change politics, you can't just come in and start mouthing off about like some radical political vision, because nobody's going to take you seriously. In order to institute a radical political vision, or any political vision, you have to work with the people. You have to take an issue that is important to someone and work with them on that issue. It's not simply just like hammering them on the head with a mallet in order to convince them to change things, which is how I feel about like this sort of training in Denmark to become a Danish person. It's just like, you must be Danish. You must believe in these things. No, that doesn't work. You have to be like, okay, what are our shared values? What do you celebrate? What do we celebrate? How can we integrate elements of these two cultures together? Like the songbird institutes songs together, brings songs together into a new song. Because at least my understanding is that there's valuable parts of both cultures, right? There's valuable parts of the culture that's come in, and there's valuable parts of the culture that was there. And better than attempting to just erase one of those and replace it with the other, it makes way more sense to try to bring those together and develop something new out of the two. Yeah, rather than, I think this speaks to the heart of affirmation rather than negation. Because there are things that are selected, there are things that are negated, but it's not an active negation that's negating, it's an active affirmation that's negating in this process. It's negating stuff that just falls to the wayside in order for the new song to take place, the new refrain.
Yeah, I mean, I'm of course reminded of the passage in the preface of Difference and Repetition. You know, we are different, but we are not opposed, right? Though I do think, especially with regards to, I've already forgotten what country we were talking about. But with regards to that, I'm from Denmark. Great, I was gonna say Sweden. Though I'm sure horrible things are also happening there with regards to immigration policy. But I'm at least presently reminded of something I read. It had to have been at least 2 years ago, and I've completely forgotten what the actual source is. But the general principle was that there is no Europe. There is no European identity. There is no real Europe to speak of. These are sort of fake boundaries placed around some territory that is already. I think that it's at least it becomes sort of a question of not just like selecting the good of the other here, but also in starting to really question. I think that this starts to at least question what Europe is for a lot of European citizens and for a lot of citizens of countries that are being affected by waves of immigrants and by mass amounts of refugees in the countries. And I think that far too often, again, we see these people who want to defend this kind of like non-existent territory and almost non-existent culture. At least that would be how I would see the issue, or is how I see it, I guess. And it's not to say that there is no European culture that we can speak of, but I think especially with regards to our contemporary condition, it's kind of hard to speak of some unified or European, that it always has not. I shouldn't say always. Of course, there have been moments in European history that are just absolutely atrocious, but but there have been moments in history, moments where we've seen massive changes to what it means, and I think that it's not just a how do we change ourselves and the other, but more so how do we both in changing ourselves and changing that which is an other to us, change Europe as a whole, or I guess change the world. And how does that sort of being comfortable with that in a certain sense?
Yeah, I think the framing that maybe I've instituted is a little bit troubling, but I think if we think about it in a different way, that it can be like less harsh sounding, like we're going to change you and change ourselves. So like we've been watching Queer Eye, the show, and in one of the episodes they make over this mayor of this small town in Georgia, and this small town is like he's this progressive mayor, but they've instituted this policy of like bringing in tons of refugees into this small town of like 10,000 people, and I think they've brought in over 4,000 refugees to this town. So they've almost that's like half their population of new people coming into the town. And how they've worked with, and this is in Georgia, like heart of the South, Georgia, right? So what they've done is they celebrate the holiday. So they put on these big celebrations for every holiday of every religion that's represented in the town, and like try to get everybody to come out for these religious celebrations. And I think this works in a different way than like we're going to change you and we're going to change us. It happens more organically, right? Because like anytime you interact with somebody who's different than you, you're changed by that experience. You might understand them a little bit better. You might hate them a little bit more, like depending on the interaction. You're affected on a molecular level in ways you don't think about. And so like framing it as an intentional attempt to change things, yeah, that's super harsh and maybe problematic. But if you think about it in terms of like this resonating together and learning from each other, rather than being like, we're trying to institute this thing on you, but thinking through it in terms of like a sort of bilateral sort of refrain where you're listening to each other's songs, and changing through that experience of listening to the song of the other, or the other assemblage is affecting you, right? So this act of like communal celebration is sort of an abstract machine that opens up a line to the other assemblage, right? This other culture, in a way that doesn't happen typically when you have just insular communities that only celebrate among themselves. So I think, yeah, I think it's easy to think about it on a molar level, like we're going to change you, and yeah, that's horrible.
Yeah, I'm always reminded of something else. I don't know why I can't just talk off my own words. But, I guess I'll try. I'll do a nice little experiment of using my own words. Uh, I think here cooking is a great example of assemblage, which introduces a new ingredient or changes the whole thing. I have a cookbook that Julia Child wrote, Mastering the Art of French Cooking, right? And it's interesting to me because the difference between like the difference between using a heavy cream and using milk in omelet, or geez, I was trying to think of a dish and prove like, yes, I actually read this book, but I can't right now. But they take on new signifiers. They take on new they go by different names, in French at least. In English they're the same thing, but I do think that the introduction of a new ingredient, or the removal of an ingredient, it's not just a question of changing the ingredients by the process of cooking, but it's changing the entire dish. And it is something that we should, I guess I would feel more comfortable framing it in the sense of, what new Denmarks are being produced, right, by the introduction of, a refugee, or what new Europes are produced, or what new universes are produced, right? Yeah. So.
Yeah, I think the idea of cooking is really interesting. So like, because you can think about like a relative change in the recipe. So like if you're making chocolate chip cookies, if you use like more brown sugar than white sugar, you get a certain consistency of the cookie. If you get rid of the white sugar and just use brown sugar, I think it becomes more less cakey. And if you use more white sugar, it becomes more cakey. And so this is like a relative change. But if you change, say, baking soda to baking powder, and you use more liquid or something, it'll change into maybe a cake. Based on like subtle ingredient differences, it's going to come out completely different. So that's how to think through like these different changes, whether it's relative from a change within the territory, or this absolute sort of breaking through a threshold into completely different assemblage. What might be interesting is thinking through like the difference between territory and assemblage in this chapter, because they do kind of set that up, which I thought was important because it's so easy to use these terms synonyms, but I think there's at least a subtle difference between the two. And I'm not sure I'm completely clear on that difference. So it seems that so there's two terms that are very similar. There's territorial and territorialized. And territorial seems to be the act of like selecting milieus from, so, well, first you have chaos. We're not told a ton about chaos. All we know is it's directional. And then there's these rhythms and milieus that form out of the chaos. They're sort of like, the milieu is a repetition of something within chaos. And I think it's some sort of relationship with rhythm, where rhythm is the rhythm of that repetition. But anyway, they form into these milieus, and then the territorial selects milieus shape into a territorialized assemblage. And then, so like that seems to be, those are like the first two elements of the refrain, because there's three. There's the chaos, there's the, I can't remember all of them, territorialized, and I think then the final one is the, it would be like akin to a line of flight, but I can't remember exactly what they call it here.
Did they call it a cosmic?
Yes. It's like open to the cosmos. I don't even know what that really means. It seems to go along with the idea of like the infinite, the finite, and the Superman that Deleuze talks about in his book on Foucault, and Foucault talks about in The Order of Things, and I think Deleuze also talks about it in his book on Leibniz, but I'm not sure about that last one. But yeah, this open to the cosmos seems to be like, so there's an intra-assemblage, which I think is assemblages that are in relationship to each other as a result of machines, and that seems to have like this sort of relative deterritorialization. And then there's this opening to the cosmos, which is like this sort of absolute deterritorialization. But I don't know, they didn't seem as concrete about this open to the cosmos, and perhaps that's because it's like this purely speculative act of the modern.
Yeah, I throughout like the whole thing, the bit in the middle after you get the whole thing about the refrain when they're talking about infra-assemblage, intra-assemblage, and inter-assemblage, my dyslexia was all over the place. But I just kept thinking like, okay, infra is below, intra is within, inter is among. And I didn't really catch a lot of like the different, I don't know, mechanisms by which these things are moving from one to the other. But I was really interested in the bit about towards the end where they're talking about art. And you just bringing up Foucault now makes me think of something that's in The Order of Things. I don't know the exact quote, but it's something like, why is art only something that's in the domain of the professional, the poet? Why is a lamp an art object, and why is a table a lamp object or an art object? Why can't life be an art object? And this also makes me think about something I said last week about them sort of going towards a biomimicry, and I regret saying that because this bit about the refrain made me think that they're like very anti-mimetic. Like it's not a mimicry that they're going after here. It's like an actual equality between these things. Like it's the functions of the membranes themselves is no different between my thing. So it's not mimicking it. Well, yeah, in some way, like you then set everything up. It then like collapses into their whole thing about it just being greater degrees of perfection or something. But I found the whole thing about music really interesting. I myself am not much of a musician, but I used to. But there's this bit where they're talking about, I'm assuming they're talking about Bach, but they're talking about the Bourrée, the Allemand, all of these things that are in Bach's cello and violin suites. And as, two schizophrenics talking and having this sort of unknown conversation. And the classical era was sort of representing this chaotic thing where there is no real sign, or the signs are being set up. And then, you have the Romantic era, which is, I think of Bartok, where Bartok took, all of these musical forms that had been introduced since Bach, and then he took musical forms of the Romani or Roma, and incorporated them into his Hungarian dances. But being that the Romantic era is an era of the earth, these all got collapsed into like nationalistic bullshit. And I found it sort of interesting that there's only a few, I guess, references to music in the modern era. They reference, what's his name? Cage, the guy with all the weird piano stuff, and Silence. But I found it more interesting to sort of think about the work of Harry Parch, who's a classical composer, but he essentially, got through school, he studied composition, and then he graduated around the end of the Depression and was like, fuck all of this, I'm just going to become a drifter. And he traveled all the way to the west coast of America and wrote these songs using this way of notation that he himself invented, and he recorded the exact tones of these human conversations and made them into musical arrangements. So his music, I'm sorry, his music has this sort of cosmic nature about it, where these things are, you would think that it's produced by a synthesizer in the way that it's produced, but it's really, he's written down the way that the human voice modulates between pitches. And in doing so, it takes on this quality that almost you would think it's like aliens writing down the way that we record human pitch. And I have gotten a little off track from what I was talking about here. But I've sort of been thinking about a question about what to do with these education things on Danish culture. And I sort of, I want to go with Tegan about there not really being a Europe. Like, there has been a Russia. They have like the Internationale or whatever their anthem is. But like what we call Europe has never really been this thing other than the United or the European Union. Like I think about Italy, where until the 1970s, the Italians had 30 different dialects of the language, and it was all formalized under, the creation of Italian folk songs and in the language of the television. But I forgot where I was going. Yeah.
So I wonder if this idea that there has never been a Europe, in terms of like a molar identity, perhaps Europe is more of a molecular sort of assemblage. It's more perhaps in that way it's more supple, but certain parties want it to be a molar assemblage. And it depends on what you're talking about in Europe. Perhaps like Britain is more molar than the UK, or France is more molar than Italy, or something like this. But I think that's maybe that's a possibility. And I don't know. I'm trying to think about like how can we understand like the differences that we have, because we have this thing. It's called Denmark. We have this thing. It's called Germany. Whatever they are, whether or not they have like a strong established culture, it is a thing. It is some sort of molar aggregate. It might not have a strong nomos, but it has a polis, right? And how do we think through this aggregate? And it might even be a fuzzy aggregate. But there's a new aggregate that's coming into that space. It's happened in the US too, right? There's people coming into the US. And it's hard to think of the US as a molar aggregate, right? It's a giant swath of land that has all sorts of different identities throughout. But it in some way, it is a fuzzy molar aggregate that is having different peoples come onto it. And there are different ways of dealing with that. And there's ways that, like, I think are absolutely horrific, and I think most people think are absolutely horrific. And I think that in a lot of senses, that those horrific attempts to deal with this phenomena are attempts that try to impose the will of this molar aggregate on these groups, these other aggregates. It's one force attempting to unilaterally deterritorialize another force. And I don't know, I wonder if we're going to think politically, how can we think it in a way that doesn't reduce it to an opposition between two assemblages? And I'm wondering if the idea of the refrain and the idea of the resonance in the song can help with that. But there's so much you can talk about politically in terms of refrains.
Yeah, I'm thinking about something. I don't know if I read it or saw it somewhere, but there were in Norway, I believe, there was those large tenement house apartment things that are in former socialist bloc countries, but it was this group of people who, in order to sort of unify their community, were having these garage sale or bazaar like things. Where you have Indian women who are selling samosas, and I don't know where the country was at, but European food, and those things are being shared and whatnot, this, that, and the other. But I sort of, if I have to choose something of Arab refugees integrating with European culture, it would seem that sort of interaction of a bazaar that's set out by your neighborhood association or whatever the hell, but that seems much more favorable than, hey, take this class and learn what Easter is. Meanwhile, we don't know what Eid is.
So we have, we're pretty much done. We have about 4 more minutes. So next week we will be doing the 5th plateau, which is several regimes of signs, and the 7th plateau, the year 0 faciality. So yeah, just want to mention that before we close, because this will be over in about 3 minutes now. But I want to thank both of you for showing up and talking. Unfortunately, there weren't more people who were able to come today, but hopefully next week we'll have some more people. Hopefully Simon will be back, and hopefully Dave will be back, and maybe Michael. But yeah, I think that the Refrain Plateau is one that I didn't pay as much attention to on my first read through, and I'm really glad that I was able to go through. I went through it twice this week, so pretty happy with that. I just want to, for my final thought, I want to quote the final line of the Plateau because I think it's really good. Except we can never be sure we will be strong enough, for we have no system, only lines and movements. I think that's really interesting. We don't have a system. It's reminding me of like Tikkun's "This is not a program." It's just these lines. That's what we have. And we got to figure out how to use them. We got to weaponize them because Deleuze and Guattari are all about weapons. But yeah, I don't know if anybody has a final thought in the last 2 minutes.
I guess I'll also read a passage from Chiasmosis, which I think is a great text if either of you haven't read it. But it's page 91. This is not about making artists the new heroes of the revolution, the new levelers of history. Art is not just the activity of established artists, but of a whole subjective creativity which traverses the generations and oppressed peoples, ghettos, minorities. I simply want to stress that the aesthetic paradigm, the creation and composition of mutant precepts and affect, has become the paradigm for every possible form of liberation. So I'll leave you with that.
No, that's good.
Keeping with the trend, I'll read one from 344. The more rarefied the atmosphere, the more disparate the elements you find. Your synthesis of disparate elements will be all the stronger if you proceed with a sober gesture, an act of consistency, capture, or abstraction that works in a material that is not meager but prodigiously simplified, creatively limited and selected. For there is no imagination outside of technique. The modern figure is not the child or the lunatic, still less the artisan, but the cosmic artisan, a homemade atomic bomb. It's very simple, really. It's been proven. It's been done. To be an artist and no longer an artist, a creator or a founder is the only way to become cosmic, to leave the milieus and the earth behind.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, we're at time right now. So thank you guys, and hope to see you next week. I think the faciality plateau is going to be real interesting.
Yeah.